Sarah Martinez stepped off the bus at Fort Benning, Georgia, her heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and terror. The scorching August sun beat down mercilessly as she joined the line of new recruits, all looking equally nervous and overwhelmed. At 22, she was older than most of the fresh-faced teenagers around her, but that didn't make the moment any less intimidating. The drill sergeants were already shouting orders, their voices cutting through the humid air like knives. Sarah quickly learned to keep her eyes forward and her mouth shut, just as her older brother had advised before she left home in Los Angeles. He had served 2 tours in Afghanistan and had prepared her for the intensity, but nothing could truly ready someone for the complete shock to the system that was military basic training. As they were herded into formation, Sarah caught glimpses of her fellow recruits. There was Tommy, a scrawny kid from Ohio who looked like he might blow away in a strong wind. Next to him stood Marcus, a mountain of a young man from Texas who seemed more confident than the rest. Behind her, she could hear the nervous breathing of Jessica, a quiet girl from Vermont who had barely spoken 2 words since they'd met on the bus. The first few hours were a blur of paperwork, medical examinations, and constant yelling. Sarah's head was spinning as they were assigned to their barracks and given their initial uniforms. The drill sergeants seemed to take particular pleasure in finding fault with everything the recruits did, no matter how trivial. Sergeant First Class Rodriguez was their primary drill instructor, a compact man with steel-gray eyes and a voice that could wake the dead. He had served multiple combat deployments and carried himself with the kind of confidence that came from surviving real warfare. When he looked at the new recruits, Sarah could see the assessment in his eyes, weighing each of them to determine who would make it and who would wash out. The first real test came during the initial fitness evaluation. As they lined up in their new PT uniforms, Sarah became acutely aware of the stares and whispers from some of the male recruits. She had always been athletic, playing soccer and running track in high school, but she was also petite at 5'4", which seemed to invite doubt about her capabilities. "Look at that tiny thing," she heard one of the recruits mutter behind her. "She'll be crying for her mommy by the end of the week." Another voice chimed in, "I give her 3 days, max." This ain't a place for little girls playing soldier. Sarah kept her expression neutral, but their words stung. She had worked 2 jobs to save money for college and had decided to join the army to pay for her education and serve her country. Her father had been a Vietnam veteran, and military service ran deep in her family's blood. She wasn't here on a whim or because she had no other options. The physical training test began with push-ups. Sarah dropped into position, her form perfect from years of athletic training. As Sergeant Rodriguez called out the count, she pushed through each repetition with determination. While some of the other recruits struggled and fell behind, Sarah maintained her pace, her movements crisp and controlled. During the sit-ups portion, she noticed more stares from her fellow recruits. Some seemed surprised by her performance, while others appeared almost resentful. The whispers continued when they moved on to the 2-mile run, with several recruits making bets about when she would fall out of formation or ask for a break. Sarah had always been a strong runner, and the Georgia heat didn't faze her as much as it did some of the others. She settled into a steady rhythm, her breathing controlled and her pace consistent. One by one, she passed recruits who had started ahead of her, including some of the larger males who had been so confident earlier. As she crossed the finish line in the top 10% of her group, she could see the surprise on Sergeant Rodriguez's face. He marked something on his clipboard and gave her a slight nod of acknowledgement, which felt like high praise given his usual demeanor. The first few weeks of basic training were brutal for everyone. Wake-up calls came at 0430 hours, followed by immediate physical training, then chow, then hours of drill and ceremony, weapons training, and classroom instruction. The days were long and exhausting, designed to break down civilian habits and build military discipline. Sarah threw herself into every aspect of training with fierce determination. While other recruits complained about the food, the early hours, and the constant pressure, she focused on improving her skills and proving herself worthy of the uniform she was earning. She studied military history and regulations late into the night, practiced her marching steps until they were perfect, and pushed herself harder during every PT session. The mocking didn't stop, though. It became more subtle as the weeks progressed. During chow time, she would overhear comments about diversity hires and questions about whether standards were being lowered to accommodate women. Some recruits seemed to believe that her presence somehow diminished their own achievements, Private Johnson, a recruit from Alabama, with a thick drawl and an even thicker prejudice, seemed particularly invested in making Sarah's life difficult. He would accidentally bump into her during formations, make snide comments about women in combat roles, and generally do his best to undermine her confidence. "You know this is just a phase, right?" he said to her one evening as they cleaned their weapons. "Once you get to real training, when the bullets start flying, you'll realize this isn't a game for little girls." Sarah continued cleaning her M4 rifle with methodical precision, not giving him the satisfaction of a response. She had learned early in her life that the best way to deal with bullies was to let her actions speak louder than her words. The harassment wasn't limited to Johnson either. A small group of recruits had formed an informal alliance based on their shared belief that women didn't belong in combat roles. They would make comments about political correctness and social experiments whenever Sarah or the other female recruits excelled at training exercises. What they didn't know, and what Sarah kept carefully hidden beneath her uniform, was a story that would change everything if it ever came to light. On her neck, usually concealed by her collar, was a small tattoo that told a tale of sacrifice, heroism, and loss that none of them could imagine. The tattoo was simple in design but profound in meaning. It consisted of military dog tags with a date inscribed below them, along with the coordinates of a specific location in Afghanistan. To most people, it would look like a memorial tattoo for a fallen soldier, which wasn't uncommon among military families. But the truth behind those coordinates and that date held a secret that even her own family didn't fully understand. As the training weeks progressed, Sarah's performance continued to improve. She scored expert on her weapons qualification, earned top marks in her physical fitness tests, and showed natural leadership abilities during squad exercises. Her drill sergeants began to take notice, and even some of her fellow recruits started to show her grudging respect. But the core group of doubters remained stubborn in their belief that she didn't belong. They interpreted her success as evidence of preferential treatment rather than earned achievement. The tension in the barracks grew thicker with each passing day, and Sarah could feel that something was building toward a confrontation. Late one evening, as she was writing a letter home to her mother, Private Johnson approached her bunk with several of his allies in tow. The barracks were quiet except for the sound of snoring and the occasional rustle of someone turning over in their sleep. "Martinez," Johnson whispered harshly, "we need to have a conversation." Sarah looked up from her letter, her expression calm but alert. She could see the aggressive posture of the group and knew that this moment had been inevitable since the first day of training. "What's on your mind, Johnson?" she replied quietly, not wanting to wake the entire barracks. "What's on my mind is that you don't belong here," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "This is a man's job, and no matter how many push-ups you can do or how fast you can run, you're still just a little girl playing dress-up in a soldier's uniform." The other recruits in his group nodded in agreement, their faces showing varying degrees of hostility and superiority. Sarah could see that they had planned this confrontation, probably discussing it for days before working up the courage to actually face her. "I've earned my place here just like everyone else," Sarah said calmly, setting down her pen and meeting Johnson's gaze directly. "My test scores, my fitness results, and my training performance speak for themselves." "That's exactly the problem," Johnson shot back. "You think because you can keep up with the basic requirements, that makes you equal to us. But when the real shooting starts, when lives are on the line, physical strength and mental toughness matter more than political correctness." Sarah felt her temper beginning to rise, but she kept her voice level. "You don't know anything about me, Johnson. You don't know where I come from or what I've been through. You're making assumptions based on ignorance." "I know enough," he replied smugly. "I know you're here because the Army needs to fill quotas, not because you're actually qualified to be a soldier. And I know that when things get rough, you'll crack just like every other woman who's tried to play in the big leagues." The confrontation was interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching through the barracks. Sergeant Rodriguez had apparently heard the conversation and was making his way toward their area. The group of antagonistic recruits quickly dispersed, melting back to their bunks like shadows. "Lights out was 30 minutes ago," Rodriguez said in a low, dangerous voice. "Whatever discussion you're having can wait until tomorrow. Now get some sleep before I decide you all need some extra PT in the morning." As the barracks fell silent once again, Sarah lay in her bunk staring at the ceiling. She knew that the confrontation with Johnson and his group was far from over. They would continue to test her, to try to provoke her into making a mistake that would validate their prejudices. What they didn't realize was that Sarah had been tested by fire long before she ever set foot in boot camp. The tattoo on her neck was proof of that, though she had no intention of revealing its meaning unless absolutely necessary. Some stories were too painful to share, and some secrets were too important to use as weapons in petty conflicts. But as she finally drifted off to sleep, Sarah couldn't help but wonder how long she could keep her past hidden. The training was only going to get more intense, and eventually, the truth about who she really was and what she had experienced would find a way to surface. When that moment came, everything would change. The morning after the confrontation brought no relief from the tension that had been building in the barracks. If anything, Johnson and his group seemed more determined than ever to prove their point about women in combat roles. During the pre-dawn physical training session, Sarah noticed them watching her every move, waiting for any sign of weakness or failure. The day's training schedule included advanced combat simulations, something that several of the male recruits had been looking forward to as their chance to demonstrate superior performance. These exercises involved complex scenarios that tested not just physical capabilities, but also decision-making under pressure, tactical thinking, and leadership skills. Sergeant Rodriguez briefed the recruits on the day's activities with his usual no-nonsense approach. "Today we're going to see what you're really made of," he announced as they stood in formation in the pre-dawn darkness. "These scenarios are designed to push you beyond your comfort zone and test your ability to function as soldiers under stress." The first exercise involved navigating an obstacle course while carrying a wounded teammate. Partners were assigned randomly, and Sarah found herself paired with Marcus, the large recruit from Texas who had generally kept to himself during training. Unlike Johnson's group, Marcus seemed more interested in succeeding than in proving points about gender roles. "Just keep up," Marcus said simply as they approached the starting line. "I'll handle the heavy lifting if you handle the thinking." Sarah appreciated his straightforward approach and nodded in agreement. When the whistle blew, they moved into action with surprising coordination. Sarah's smaller size actually proved advantageous in several obstacles, allowing her to squeeze through tight spaces and scout ahead, while Marcus used his strength to clear larger barriers. Johnson's group watched from their own starting positions, clearly expecting to see Sarah struggle with the physical demands of the exercise. Instead, they witnessed something that challenged their preconceptions. Sarah and Marcus worked together seamlessly, with Sarah often taking the lead in problem-solving and route selection, while Marcus provided the muscle when needed. When they reached the casualty evacuation portion of the course, Sarah surprised everyone by insisting that she take her turn carrying Marcus despite the significant size difference between them. Using techniques she had learned from previous experience, she managed to transport him efficiently across the required distance, her form perfect and her determination unwavering. "Where'd you learn to do that?" Marcus asked as they completed the exercise with one of the best times in their group. Sarah paused for a moment, considering how much to reveal. "I've had some experience with emergency situations," she said simply, leaving the details vague. The second exercise of the day involved urban combat simulations using paintball weapons in a mock city environment. This was where many recruits expected traditional advantages of size and strength to really matter. The scenarios required teams to clear buildings, secure objectives, and respond to ambush situations. Sarah was assigned to a squad with several recruits who had been neutral in the ongoing conflict about her presence, including Jessica from Vermont and 2 others she hadn't interacted with. Much Johnson managed to maneuver himself into the opposing team, clearly seeing this as his opportunity to demonstrate her inadequacy in a combat situation. What followed was a masterclass in tactical thinking and situational awareness that left the drill sergeants taking detailed notes. Sarah seemed to anticipate enemy movements before they happened, positioning her team advantageously and making split-second decisions that consistently put them ahead of their opponents. During one particularly complex scenario, her team was trapped in a building with hostile forces closing in from multiple directions. While the other recruits looked to the designated team leader for instructions, Sarah quietly assessed the situation and identified an escape route that none of them had considered. "There's a way through the basement that connects to the adjacent building," she whispered to her team leader. "If we move now, we can flank them instead of getting pinned down here." The team leader, initially skeptical, decided to trust her assessment. The maneuver worked perfectly, allowing them to turn a potential defeat into a decisive victory. Even more impressive was how Sarah seemed to know exactly when and where the opposing forces would be positioned, almost as if she had experienced similar situations before. Johnson's team found themselves consistently outmaneuvered and defeated, despite his confident predictions about how the exercises would play out. His frustration was evident as they regrouped after each scenario, and Sarah could see his anger building toward a breaking point. The final exercise of the day was a leadership rotation, where each recruit had to take command of the squad for a specific scenario. When Sarah's turn came, she was given one of the most challenging situations, a hostage rescue mission in a confined space with multiple threats and innocent civilians to protect. As she briefed her team on the plan of attack, several of the drill sergeants moved closer to observe her leadership style. What they witnessed was a level of tactical sophistication that was unusual for a new recruit. Sarah's instructions were precise, her reasoning was sound, and her ability to anticipate potential complications showed a depth of understanding that typically came only with experience. Martinez, Sergeant Rodriguez called out after the exercise was completed successfully. "Stay behind for a moment. The rest of you, dismissed for chow." As the other recruits filed away, many casting curious glances back at Sarah, she approached the drill sergeant with some apprehension. Private conversations with drill instructors were rarely positive experiences during basic training. "That was impressive work today," Rodriguez said, his tone more conversational than usual. "Your tactical thinking is advanced for someone with no prior military experience. Where did you learn to think like that?" Sarah felt the familiar tension that came whenever someone got too close to asking the right questions. "I've always been interested in military history and tactics, Sergeant. I've done a lot of reading and studying." Rodriguez studied her face carefully, his experienced eyes noting the slight hesitation in her response. "Reading is one thing, Martinez, but what you demonstrated today goes beyond book learning. You moved and thought like someone who's been in real situations." "I've just always had good instincts, I guess," Sarah replied, trying to keep her voice steady. The drill sergeant was quiet for a long moment, clearly processing something. "There's more to your story than you're telling, isn't there? I can see it in the way you carry yourself, the way you assess threats, the way you never seem surprised by anything we throw at you." Sarah met his gaze directly, knowing that lying to him would be both futile and disrespectful. "Everyone has a story, Sergeant. Some are just more complicated than others." Rodriguez nodded slowly, seeming to understand that she wasn't ready to share whatever she was hiding. "Fair enough. But I want you to know that if there's something you think I should know, something that might be relevant to your training or your future in the Army, my door is always open." "Thank you, Sergeant. I'll keep that in mind." As Sarah made her way to the Chow Hall, she couldn't shake the feeling that her carefully maintained privacy was beginning to crack. Sergeant Rodriguez was too experienced and too perceptive to be fooled indefinitely. Eventually, someone was going to ask the right questions or notice the right details, and her secret would be exposed. The afternoon brought weapons, maintenance, and cleaning, usually a quiet time when recruits could catch their breath and focus on individual tasks, but Johnson seemed determined to use every opportunity to continue his campaign of harassment. "You know, Martinez," he said loudly enough for others to hear as they worked on their rifles, "I've been thinking about your performance today. It was pretty impressive for a beginner." Sarah continued cleaning her weapon without looking up, sensing the trap in his seemingly complimentary tone. "In fact," Johnson continued, "it was almost too impressive. Like maybe you've had some training before that you haven't mentioned. Makes a person wonder what else you might be hiding." This time Sarah did look up, meeting his gaze with a steady expression. "I'm not hiding anything, Johnson. I'm just here to do my job and serve my country like everyone else." "See? That's what I find interesting." Johnson pressed on, clearly enjoying the attention he was getting from the other recruits. "Most people who come here are open books. They talk about their backgrounds, their motivations, their experiences. But you're different. You keep everything locked up tight. Makes a person suspicious. Maybe I just don't feel the need to share my personal life with people who've already decided they don't like me," Sarah replied calmly. Johnson leaned back with a satisfied smile, as if her response had confirmed something for him. "Or maybe you know that if we knew the truth about you, we'd have even more reason to doubt whether you belong here." The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. Several other recruits had stopped their own work to listen to the exchange, and Sarah could feel the weight of their attention. She was at a crossroads where she could either continue deflecting Johnson's probes or find a way to shut down his harassment without revealing information she wasn't ready to share. "You seem awfully interested in my personal business, Johnson," she said finally. "Maybe you should focus more on your own performance and less on trying to tear down your fellow soldiers." "Fellow soldiers?" Johnson laughed harshly. "That's exactly the problem. You think putting on the uniform automatically makes you one of us. But being a soldier is about more than passing tests and following orders. It's about being part of something bigger than yourself, something you can't understand because you're just playing a role." Sarah felt her temper flare at the accusation, but she forced herself to remain calm. "I'm not playing anything, Johnson. I'm here for the same reasons as everyone else." "Are you?" Johnson challenged. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're here to prove a point or fill a quota or maybe just to get attention. Real soldiers don't keep secrets from their brothers in arms." The hypocrisy of his statement almost made Sarah laugh. If Johnson knew the real reason she was there, if he understood what the tattoo on her neck represented, he would realize that her commitment to the military was deeper and more personal than his could ever be. But that truth was exactly what she couldn't afford to reveal. "I don't owe you or anyone else my life story," Sarah said firmly. "My performance speaks for itself, and that's all that matters." Johnson stood up from his cleaning station, his body language becoming more aggressive. "Actually, I think it matters a lot. If you're hiding something that affects unit cohesion or trust, then it's everyone's business." Other recruits began to shift uncomfortably as the confrontation escalated. Some seemed to agree with Johnson's position, while others appeared to think he was going too far. The tension in the room was building toward a breaking point. "What exactly are you accusing me of, Johnson?" Sarah asked, also standing up to face him directly. "I'm not accusing you of anything specific," Johnson replied with false innocence. "I'm just saying that secrets have a way of coming out eventually, and when they do, don't expect us to pretend we're surprised." The standoff might have continued indefinitely if not for the sudden appearance of Colonel Morrison, the base commander, who entered the weapons cleaning area for an unscheduled inspection. His presence immediately changed the atmosphere as all recruits snapped to attention. Colonel Morrison was a distinguished officer with silver hair and sharp eyes who commanded respect through his bearing alone. He had served in multiple combat zones and was known for his fair but demanding leadership style. His unexpected visit sent a ripple of nervous energy through the room. "As you were," the colonel said after returning their salutes. "I'm here to observe your weapons maintenance procedures and get a sense of how this cycle of recruits is progressing." He moved through the room methodically, examining weapons and asking occasional questions about proper cleaning techniques. When he reached Sarah's station, he paused to inspect her rifle more carefully than the others. "This is excellent work, Martinez," he said, noting the pristine condition of her weapon. "Your attention to detail is impressive." "Thank you, sir," Sarah replied, maintaining her position of attention. The colonel studied her face for a moment, something flickering in his expression that Sarah couldn't quite identify. "Tell me, what motivated you to join the army?" The question was direct and demanded an honest answer. Sarah could feel Johnson and the others listening intently, waiting to hear how she would respond to such a high-ranking officer. "I believe in service to my country, sir. My family has a history of military service, and I want to continue that tradition while also taking advantage of the educational opportunities the Army provides." It was a safe, politically correct answer that revealed nothing controversial while still being truthful. Colonel Morrison nodded approvingly, but Sarah could see that he was still studying her with unusual interest. As he moved on to the next station, Sarah caught a glimpse of something that made her blood run cold. For just a moment, as the colonel turned his head, she saw part of a tattoo on his neck that looked remarkably similar to her own. The coordinates were different, and the date was earlier, but the style and design were unmistakably from the same source. Their eyes met across the room, and Sarah realized that Colonel Morrison had noticed her recognition. A look of understanding passed between them that was invisible to everyone else in the room, but loaded with meaning for both of them. The inspection concluded without further incident, but as Colonel Morrison prepared to leave, He paused at the door. "Sergeant Rodriguez, please have Private Martinez report to my office tomorrow at 0800 hours. I'd like to discuss her career goals and potential opportunities." The announcement sent a shock through the room. Private meetings with the base commander were virtually unheard of for basic training recruits, and everyone began speculating about what it could mean. Johnson's expression was particularly dark as he realized that his campaign to undermine Sarah might have just backfired spectacularly. As the colonel left the room, Sarah tried to process what had just happened. The brief glimpse of his tattoo and the knowing look he had given her suggested that her secret might not be as well hidden as she had thought. But what frightened her more was the possibility that her past was about to catch up with her in ways she had never anticipated. The night before her scheduled meeting with Colonel Morrison, Sarah barely slept. She lay in her bunk staring at the ceiling, her mind racing through possible explanations for why the base commander wanted to see her. The brief moment when their eyes had met during the weapons inspection kept replaying in her memory, along with the unsettling glimpse of his tattoo. Around her, the barracks was filled with the usual sounds of sleeping recruits, but Sarah could sense that others were awake too. Word of her private meeting with the colonel had spread quickly, generating whispers and speculation that continued well past lights out. Johnson and his allies were particularly vocal in their theories, most of which painted her as either a security risk or someone with inappropriate connections. "I'm telling you, there's something fishy about this whole thing," she heard Johnson whisper to one of his friends. "Normal recruits don't get private meetings with base commanders. Either she's got family connections pulling strings, or she's hiding something that's finally caught up with her." Sarah forced herself to ignore the comments and focus on preparing for what could be the most important conversation of her military career. Depending on what Colonel Morrison knew or suspected, this meeting could either advance her goals or end them completely. At 0730 hours, she made her way to the administration building where the colonel's office was located. The early morning sun cast long shadows across the base as she walked, and she could feel eyes watching her from various windows and doorways. News of her meeting had spread beyond her immediate training group, and it seemed like half the base was curious about what was happening. The colonel's secretary, a efficient-looking staff sergeant, directed her to wait in a small anteroom outside the main office. Sarah sat rigidly in her dress uniform, which she had pressed and prepared with meticulous care. Every button, every crease, every detail had been checked and rechecked to ensure she presented the best possible appearance. At exactly 0800 hours, Colonel Morrison opened his office door and gestured for her to enter. "Private Martinez, please come in. Have a seat." The office was spartanly decorated but filled with mementos from a long and distinguished career. Sarah noticed photographs from various deployments, commendations, and awards displayed on the walls, and a bookshelf filled with military history and tactical manuals. Everything spoke of a serious professional who had dedicated his life to military service. "At ease, Private," the colonel said as he took his seat behind an imposing wooden desk. "This isn't a formal disciplinary meeting. I asked you here because I have some questions about your background and your performance during training." Sarah sat in the offered chair, maintaining perfect posture while trying to keep her expression neutral. "Yes, sir. I'm happy to answer any questions you have." Colonel Morrison studied her for a moment before opening a file folder that had been placed on his desk. "Your training record is quite impressive, Martinez. Top scores in physical fitness, weapons qualification, tactical exercises, and leadership evaluations. Your drill sergeants speak very highly of your potential." "Thank you, sir. I'm committed to giving my best effort in all aspects of training." "I'm sure you are," the colonel replied, his tone suggesting there was more to come. "But what interests me even more than your performance is your background, or rather, the lack of detailed information about certain aspects of your background." Sarah felt her heart rate increase but maintained her composure. "Sir, I've provided all the information required during my enlistment process. My background investigation was completed without any issues." "That's true," Morrison acknowledged. "Your official records are clean and complete, but there are some gaps, some periods of time that aren't fully accounted for. Plus, there are certain skills and knowledge you've demonstrated that suggest experiences not reflected in your file." The colonel leaned back in his chair, his expression becoming more direct. Yesterday, during the weapons inspection, I noticed something that caught my attention. Would you mind removing your outer uniform top for a moment? Sarah's blood ran cold. This was the moment she had been dreading since the day she enlisted. There was no way to refuse a direct order from the base commander, but exposing her tattoo would open doors that she wasn't ready to walk through. "Sir, is that really necessary?" she asked, knowing it was a futile attempt to avoid the inevitable. "I'm afraid it is, Private. Please stand up and remove your uniform top." With trembling hands, Sarah stood and carefully removed her dress uniform jacket and the undershirt beneath it, leaving her in her regulation t-shirt. The tattoo on her neck was now clearly visible, though still partially concealed by the t-shirt collar. Colonel Morrison stood up and walked around his desk to examine the tattoo more closely. What he saw made him freeze in place, his face showing a mixture of shock and recognition that he couldn't hide. The tattoo consisted of military dog tags with a name, rank, and service number, along with a date and GPS coordinates. Below that were the letters KIA, and a small symbol that only certain military personnel would recognize. It was clearly a memorial tattoo, but the specific details made Colonel Morrison's face go pale. "Those coordinates," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Firebase Alpha, Helmand Province, Afghanistan, September 15th, 2019. Sarah nodded slowly, seeing no point in continuing to hide the truth now that her secret was exposed. "I was there," Morrison continued, his voice filled with emotion. "I was the commanding officer of that operation. And this name on your tattoo, Staff Sergeant Michael Martinez, my brother," Sarah said simply, her own voice thick with emotion. The silence in the room was deafening as both of them processed the magnitude of what had just been revealed. Colonel Morrison slowly walked back to his chair, his mind clearly racing through memories of that terrible day in Afghanistan. "Your brother was one of the finest soldiers I ever had the privilege to command," he said finally. "He saved dozens of lives during that firefight, including my own. His actions that day were nothing short of heroic." Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes as she heard someone else acknowledge her brother's sacrifice. "He always wanted to be a soldier, sir. From the time we were kids, it was all he ever talked about. He believed in the mission, in protecting his fellow soldiers." Morrison opened his desk drawer and pulled out a small box. Inside was a medal that Sarah recognized immediately, the silver star that her brother had been awarded posthumously for his actions during that firefight. "I've carried this with me ever since that day," the colonel said. "I kept meaning to find a way to get it to your family personally, to tell them in person about Michael's courage and sacrifice. But your family had moved, and the forwarding addresses led nowhere." "My parents were devastated," Sarah explained. "They couldn't bear to stay in the same house, the same city, where everything reminded them of Mike. They moved to a small town in Oregon and tried to start over." "And you," Morrison said, studying her face carefully, "you joined the army to follow in his footsteps." Sarah nodded, not trusting herself to speak without breaking down completely. "But there's more to this story, isn't there?" the colonel pressed gently. "Your tactical knowledge, your situational awareness, the way you handle stress, these aren't things you learn from books or even from growing up around military culture." Sarah took a deep breath, knowing that the time for partial truths had passed. "I was there too, sir. Not officially, not in any capacity that would be in any military records. But I was there." Morrison's expression showed confusion mixed with concern. "What do you mean you were there?" "There were no female soldiers in that unit and certainly no civilians. I was working for a private contractor," Sarah explained, her voice becoming stronger as she decided to tell the full truth. "Specifically, I was part of a small team providing language and cultural support services. We weren't supposed to be anywhere near combat zones, but the situation deteriorated faster than anyone anticipated." The pieces of the puzzle began falling into place for Colonel Morrison, the translator who helped coordinate the evacuation of wounded soldiers, the one who stayed behind to help with casualty care instead of evacuating with the other contractors. "That was me," Sarah confirmed. "I couldn't leave when I saw how bad the situation was getting. Mike was already wounded, and there were so many others who needed help." Morrison leaned forward, his expression intense. You were the one who dragged wounded soldiers to cover while under fire. You were the one who helped establish the casualty collection point that saved so many lives. I did what anyone would have done in that situation, Sarah said modestly. No, Morrison replied firmly. You did what a soldier would have done, what a hero would have done. And you did it while watching your own brother fight and die for his fellow soldiers. The weight of that day, of the loss and the trauma she had carried alone for so long, finally overwhelmed Sarah's composure. Tears streamed down her face as she remembered the chaos of the firefight, the desperate attempts to save wounded soldiers, and the moment when she realized that her brother wasn't going to make it home. He died saving others, she said through her tears. Even after he was wounded, even when he could have taken cover and waited for evacuation, he kept fighting to protect his squad. He died doing exactly what he always said he would do, taking care of his soldiers. Colonel Morrison stood up and walked around his desk again, this time placing a paternal hand on Sarah's shoulder. And now you're here carrying on his legacy, trying to become the soldier he always believed you could be. Sarah wiped her eyes and straightened her shoulders, finding her composure again. I couldn't save him, sir, but maybe I can honor his memory by serving the way he served, by protecting others the way he protected his soldiers. Why didn't you tell us about this when you enlisted? Morrison asked. Your experience, your actions during that firefight. They would have been valuable information for your training and assignment. Because I wanted to earn my place based on my own merit, Sarah replied. I didn't want anyone to think I was getting special treatment because of what happened to Mike or what I did that day. I wanted to prove that I belonged here, just like any other recruit. Morrison nodded in understanding. But keeping this secret has created problems for you, hasn't it? I'm aware of the tensions in your training unit, the questioning of your abilities and your motivations. Sarah thought about Johnson and his group, about all the accusations and suspicions they had directed at her. Some people think I don't belong here because I'm a woman. If they knew the truth about my background, they might think I'm only here because of my brother's sacrifice or because of connections to officers like you. And what do you think? Morrison asked pointedly. Sarah considered the question carefully before answering. I think I'm here because this is where I need to be. Mike always believed I had what it takes to be a soldier, and now I have the chance to find out if he was right. Colonel Morrison returned to his desk and made some notes in her file. Private Martinez, I'm going to recommend you for accelerated training and early consideration for leadership development programs. Your performance has been exceptional, and your experience gives you valuable perspective that the Army needs. Thank you, sir, but I don't want any special treatment. Morrison held up a hand to stop her protest. This isn't special treatment. This is recognition of demonstrated ability and potential. The Army invests in soldiers who show exceptional promise, regardless of their background or connections. He closed her file and looked at her directly. However, I do think it's time to address the situation in your training unit. The tensions and accusations you've been dealing with need to be resolved, and I believe the truth might be the best way to accomplish that. Sarah felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. What do you have in mind, sir? Tomorrow, we're conducting a special training exercise that will bring all the recruits together for a leadership and decision-making scenario. I think it might be an appropriate time to share some truths about dedication, sacrifice, and what it really means to be a soldier. As Sarah prepared to leave the colonel's office, Morrison handed her the box containing her brother's silver star. This belongs with you now. Michael would be proud to know that you're continuing his tradition of service. Sarah accepted the medal with trembling hands, feeling the weight of her brother's legacy and her own responsibility. Thank you, sir. This means more to me than I can express. One more thing, Martinez, Morrison said as she reached the door. Tomorrow's exercise is going to test everyone's assumptions about strength, courage, and what makes a good soldier. I have a feeling some of your fellow recruits are about to learn some important lessons. As Sarah walked back to the barracks, she felt a strange mixture of emotions. Relief that her secret was finally out, at least partially. Pride in her brother's continued recognition. Apprehension about what would happen when the full truth became known to her fellow recruits. She also felt something else, a sense of purpose and belonging that had been missing since Mike's death. For the first time since enlisting, she felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be, carrying forward a legacy that mattered and making her own contribution to something larger than herself. But she also knew that the hardest part was still to come. Johnson and his allies would not react well to learning the truth about her background, and the revelation might create new problems even as it solved old ones. Tomorrow's exercise would test more than just her tactical skills. It would test her ability to lead soldiers who had spent weeks questioning her very right to be among them. The morning of the special training exercise dawned gray and overcast, with a chill in the air that seemed to match the tension radiating through the assembled recruits. Word had spread that this would be no ordinary training day. Colonel Morrison himself would be observing, along with several other senior officers, and the exercise would determine final rankings before graduation from basic training. Sarah stood in formation with the rest of her company, acutely aware of the stares and whispered comments from Johnson's group. News of her private meeting with the colonel had generated even more speculation and resentment, with some recruits openly suggesting that she had received special treatment or leaked information about the unit's problems. "I bet she went crying to Daddy about how mean we've been to her," Johnson muttered loud enough for others to hear. "Probably trying to get us all in trouble because she can't handle a little honest criticism." Sarah maintained her bearing and kept her eyes forward, but she could feel the weight of suspicion and hostility from multiple directions. Even some recruits who had previously been neutral seemed to have turned against her, influenced by the constant drumbeat of accusations and rumors. Sergeant Rodriguez addressed the assembled recruits with unusual formality. "Today's exercise will test your leadership abilities, decision-making under pressure, and ability to work as a cohesive unit. You will be presented with a complex scenario that requires both tactical thinking and moral courage." He paused, scanning the faces of the recruits before continuing. "Colonel Morrison will be observing personally, along with other senior officers. Your performance today will have a significant impact on your final evaluations and future assignments." The exercise scenario was more complex than anything they had faced before. The recruits were divided into mixed teams and presented with a simulated hostage situation in a foreign country. Intelligence was limited and conflicting. Civilian casualties were a major concern, and time pressure was intense. Each team would take turns leading the planning and execution phases. Sarah found herself assigned to a team that included Johnson, Marcus from Texas, Jessica from Vermont, and 2 other recruits she barely knew. The dynamics were immediately problematic, with Johnson making it clear that he questioned her presence on the team. "Let's get one thing straight," Johnson said as they huddled together to review the scenario briefing. "I don't know what kind of special arrangement you've got going with the brass, but this is a team effort. Don't expect anyone to carry you just because you've got connections." Marcus, who had worked well with Sarah in previous exercises, spoke up. "Maybe we should focus on the mission instead of personal drama. This scenario looks complicated enough without adding unnecessary conflict." "There's nothing personal about questioning whether someone belongs on a combat team," Johnson replied. "In real situations, lives depend on every team member being qualified and capable." Sarah had reached her breaking point with Johnson's constant challenges, but before she could respond, Colonel Morrison's voice cut across the training area. "Teams, you have 10 minutes to review the scenario and begin your planning. Remember, leadership opportunities will rotate, giving everyone a chance to demonstrate their capabilities." The scenario they faced was indeed complex. Intelligence reports suggested that American contractors were being held in a compound in a hostile urban environment. The hostages' location was only approximately known, civilian populations were at risk, and enemy forces had both superior numbers and intimate knowledge of the terrain. When it came time for the first leadership rotation, Sarah volunteered to take the planning lead for her team. Johnson immediately objected, but the exercise rules required that everyone get an opportunity to lead, and Sarah had been the first to step forward. "All right, team," Sarah began, spreading out the maps and intelligence reports. "Let's break down what we know and what we don't know." As she began analyzing the scenario, something remarkable happened. The tactical knowledge and situational awareness that had impressed her instructors throughout training came together in a comprehensive and sophisticated assessment that surprised everyone listening. "The intelligence about the hostage location is intentionally vague," Sarah explained, pointing to specific areas on the map. "But if we look at the pattern of enemy movements and the infrastructure requirements for holding multiple prisoners, there are really only 3 viable locations. She outlined a plan that took into account not just the immediate tactical requirements but also the broader strategic implications of different approaches. Her analysis of enemy capabilities, civilian risk factors, and resource allocation showed a depth of understanding that went far beyond what any recruit should have possessed. Johnson found himself reluctantly impressed despite his determination to find fault with her leadership. The plan was not only tactically sound, but also creative in its approach to minimizing casualties while maximizing the chances of mission success. "How do you know all this?" Marcus asked, echoing what everyone on the team was thinking. Sarah hesitated for a moment, knowing that her answer could change everything. "I've had some experience with similar situations," she said carefully. "What kind of experience?" Johnson pressed, his suspicion overriding his surprise at her competence. Before Sarah could answer, Colonel Morrison approached their planning area. "How is the analysis progressing?" he asked, though it was clear from his tone that he had been observing their work. "Private Martinez has developed a comprehensive plan that addresses all the major tactical challenges," Marcus reported. "It's quite impressive, sir." Morrison examined the materials Sarah had prepared, nodding approvingly at the thoroughness of her work. "This is excellent analysis, Private. Your approach shows mature judgment and sophisticated thinking." Johnson could no longer contain his frustration. "Sir, with all due respect, how does a basic training recruit develop this level of tactical knowledge? It doesn't make sense unless she's had training or experience that isn't in her file." The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Sarah realized that this was the moment Colonel Morrison had been preparing for. The truth was going to come out, whether she was ready for it or not. Morrison looked directly at Sarah, giving her a slight nod of encouragement. "Private Martinez, would you like to share with your team how you develop these capabilities?" Sarah took a deep breath, knowing that everything was about to change. "My brother was Staff Sergeant Michael Martinez, killed in action in Afghanistan in 2019. I was working as a contractor in the same area when his firebase came under attack. The revelation hit the team like a physical blow." Johnson's expression went from suspicion to shock, while the others tried to process what they had just learned. "I was providing language and cultural support services," Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger. "When the attack began, I couldn't evacuate with the other contractors. There were too many wounded soldiers who needed help, and my brother was fighting to protect his squad." Morrison stepped forward to address the entire group. "What Private Martinez isn't telling you is that she stayed behind during that firefight and helped save numerous wounded soldiers under heavy enemy fire. Her actions that day were nothing short of heroic." "That's impossible," Johnson said, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. "Contractors don't participate in combat operations." "Contractors don't," Morrison replied firmly, "but heroes do. And on that day, Private Martinez chose to be a hero rather than just a contractor." Sarah's voice was barely audible as she continued. "Mike died that day protecting his soldiers. I watched him get wounded and still keep fighting, still keep his men safe until the end. I couldn't save him, but I helped save some of the others." The silence that followed was profound. Even Johnson seemed stunned into speechlessness as the implications of Sarah's revelation sank in. Everything they thought they knew about her, every assumption they had made, was suddenly turned upside down. Marcus was the first to speak. "That's why you always know exactly what to do in these scenarios. You've actually been there. And that's why you enlisted," Jessica added quietly. "You're trying to honor his memory." Sarah nodded, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "He always believed I could be a soldier, even when we were kids. He said I had the right instincts and the right heart for it. I just wanted to find out if he was right." Colonel Morrison addressed the entire group of assembled recruits, his voice carrying across the training area. "This exercise has revealed something important about courage, sacrifice, and what it truly means to be a soldier. Some of you have spent weeks questioning whether certain people belong in your ranks, making assumptions based on prejudice rather than performance." He gestured towards Sarah. "Private Martinez has already proven herself under fire in ways that most of us never will. She chose to risk her life for wounded soldiers who weren't even in her unit, who she had never met before that day. She watched her brother die a hero's death and then continued fighting to save others." The impact of Morrison's words was visible on every face in the group. Recruits who had questioned Sarah's presence, who had bought into Johnson's campaign of harassment, now looked ashamed and uncomfortable. Furthermore, Morrison continued, she came here not seeking special treatment or recognition for her previous actions, but wanting to earn her place based on her own merit. She endured weeks of questioning and harassment rather than use her background to silence her critics. Johnson looked like he wanted to disappear completely. The foundation of his opposition to Sarah, his assumption that she was weak, unqualified, or seeking special treatment, had been completely demolished by the truth about her experience and sacrifice. "Sir," Johnson said, his voice cracking with emotion, I didn't know. I made assumptions that were wrong." Sarah turned to face him directly. "You made assumptions because you decided I didn't belong here before you even got to know me. But you weren't completely wrong about one thing. I do have a secret motivation for being here. I'm here because my brother believed in me, and because I believe in the mission he died for." The exercise continued, but the dynamic had completely changed. Where there had been suspicion and hostility, there was now respect and understanding. Sarah's leadership was no longer questioned, and her tactical expertise was sought out and valued by her fellow recruits. When Johnson's turn to lead came, he made a point of consulting with Sarah about key decisions, acknowledging her experience and expertise in a way that would have been unthinkable just hours before. "I owe you an apology," he said to her during a planning break. "Not just for today, but for everything I've said and done since training started. I was wrong about you, and I'm sorry." Sarah studied his face, seeing genuine remorse and shame. "We all make mistakes, Johnson. What matters is what we do after we recognize them." As the exercise concluded, Colonel Morrison gathered all the recruits for a final debrief. "Today you've learned valuable lessons about leadership, about making assumptions, and about the true meaning of courage and sacrifice. Some of you discovered capabilities you didn't know you possessed, while others learned that they needed to examine their own prejudices and biases." He looked directly at Sarah. "Private Martinez, your performance today, combined with your previous actions under actual combat conditions, marks you as someone with exceptional potential for military leadership. I'm recommending you for officer candidate school and fast-track promotion opportunities." The announcement drew surprised murmurs from the assembled recruits. Sarah felt a mixture of pride and humility as she realized that her brother's belief in her potential was finally being validated by others who understood military service. "Thank you, sir," she replied. "I'm honored by your confidence, and I promise to live up to the trust you're placing in me." In the weeks that followed, Sarah's relationship with her fellow recruits underwent a complete transformation. Johnson became one of her strongest supporters, often telling others about her courage and the lessons he had learned from misjudging her. Marcus continued to be a reliable teammate and friend, while Jessica found in Sarah a mentor and role model for her own military aspirations. When graduation day finally arrived, Sarah stood proudly in formation, wearing the uniform her brother had always believed she deserved. The small tattoo on her neck, no longer a secret to hide, had become a symbol of honor and remembrance that her fellow soldiers respected and understood. Colonel Morrison personally presented her with her certificate and rank insignia, along with a special commendation for her performance during training. "Your brother would be proud," he said quietly as he pinned on her new rank. "I hope I can continue to honor his memory and serve with the same courage he showed." As she looked out at her fellow graduates, Sarah realized that she had accomplished something her brother had always predicted she could. She had proven herself worthy of the uniform and the trust that came with it. But more than that, she had learned that true strength came not from keeping secrets or standing alone, but from being willing to share her truth and trust others with her vulnerabilities. The little girl who had always admired her big brother's courage had finally become the soldier he had always known she could be. And in proving herself worthy of his sacrifice, she had discovered her own path to honoring his legacy, while making her own unique contribution to the mission they both believed in.